Greetings, friends. This
Приветствую.
is NewsAider. I'm Alexander Kushner. Vitaly Portnikov from Kiev is in touch with us. Hello, Vitaly. Hello, Alexander. Vitaly, how would you assess what happened? Of course, I'm talking about a situation in which Trump led sanctions against Russia for the first time, but for the first time. At least in the second cadence, these sanctions are secondary against Rosneft and Lukoil. And Vladimir Putin, as we see, although it seems to be officially saying that sanctions, of course, are not terrible, and that he is ready for dialogue. Well, despite this, we are watching a rather nervous reaction of the Kremlin, which seems to be at a loss. Well, it seems to me that we have repeatedly said with you that the moment will come when the stock of words with which Putin is trying to influence Donald Trump will be exhausted. Yes, it may have happened later than we would have liked, but earlier than Putin would have liked. By and large, what is the political task of the Russian president? He understands perfectly well that Trump cannot become his supporters and refuse to support Ukraine. But at the same time, he can count on the fact that Trump will not impose new sanctions against the Russian Federation, and will not significantly increase the volume of military assistance for Ukraine. How can this be done? Here are the constant promises to Donald Trump to achieve a solution through diplomacy. At the same time, Trump himself also has an absolutely clear task. This task was repeatedly articulated by him even before he became President of the United States of America. Ceasefire on the Russian-Ukrainian fleet. To put it simply, to make people stop killing each other. Everything else is secondary, everything else can be negotiated. And, by the way, exactly the same architecture of the peace process is observed in the Middle East. Therefore, I just see here, let's say, quite a linear situation. Many people tend to attach a conspiratorial character to reflect on Trump's dependence on Putin, on some economic agreements that exist between the presidents which prevent Trump from declaring a more active position. But in fact, everything is easier because it's not such a complicated policy and not such complicated people. Trump really wants a ceasefire because he thinks not in political categories, but if you want real estate. Is trading better than fighting? It's not a question of how many you captured, it's a question of how many you killed. No one is against you having what you have already managed to acquire, but at the same time, you have to stop killing, because it's hopeless. You've been killing for 4 years, and you're not achieving anything. In other words, this is not a conversation about international law, it is not even a conversation about any spheres of influence. This is a simple applied conversation. I am a peacemaker president. I believe that it is not necessary to kill people, it is necessary to negotiate economic benefits. And Trump started talking exactly like that with Putin, literally from their first conversation, after his election as the American leader. Because I think he sincerely believed that Biden simply could not offer Putin a good deal. Biden is always trying to get Putin to leave Ukraine so that international law prevails, so that Russia pays reparations for the destruction of Ukrainian infrastructure and the murder of Ukrainian civilians. What nonsense! The main thing is just that they stop killing each other. And Biden, instead of agreeing with Putin on how to make him stop killing Ukrainians, and, by the way, a Russian woman, Trump repeatedly emphasizes. Instead, he constantly appealed to some incomprehensible norms, incomprehensible values, which still do not help to stop the war in any way. And when Trump became president, he called and told Putin, "Vladimir, I have a great offer." And it turned out that Putin was not interested in these proposals. 1 is not interesting, 2 is not interesting, 3 is not interesting, 4 is not interesting, 5 is not interesting, 6 is not interesting, 7 is not interesting, 8 is not interesting. Meetings in Anchorage. Trump expects, well, again after Withoff's trip to Moscow, that in the course of his personal communication, he will definitely convince Putin, explain to him how profitable and good it all is. Anchorage. Putin again tells him some unintelligible things, gives a lecture on history. Irritated Trump supplies Alaska, after a while. Begins to talk about how he will supply more weapons to Ukraine, the same tomahawks. And that he can put pressure on Russia with unpleasant sanctions. He seems to be getting his way. Putin calls him for the first time in all the time of their fleeting romance. Putin himself calls. He says something to him that convinces Trump that this time Putin is definitely ready for a ceasefire. Maybe not on very favorable terms for Ukraine, but I am ready for a ceasefire. Trump shouts at Zelensky, who then comes to Washington and explains to him that Putin is ready for a ceasefire. And there is no need to be silly to talk, to invent there at all. And we need to cease fire. By the way, this is about how he essentially shouted at Netanyahu after he managed to get Qatar and Hamas to agree to a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. And when Zelensky leaves and United States Secretary of State Mark Ruby calls Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov or Lavrov for the first time after this conversation between Trump and Putin. In this case, it doesn't really matter anymore. In order to prepare a decision on the meeting with the president, Lavrov absolutely calmly, cynically, mockingly tells his American counterpart that Moscow remains in the same positions. Trump didn't understand something. Enraged Trump, once again deceived in his best feelings and expectations, introduces the first sanctions against Russia. But he says that there will be no tomahawks yet, because it takes a long time to learn to work on them. Here we are now exactly at this boiling point. Yes, one more moment, Putin really understands that the stock of words is exhausted. He sends Kirill Dmitriev to Washington, who should talk Steve Witko's teeth and again, so to speak, influence Trump, in order to prevent further escalation of the situation from the American side. Well, here we are at this point approximately. It's very simple. Then the question is why Putin, before meeting with Trump in Budapest, the alleged meeting, which eventually broke down, launches missiles, as we know, yes, these nuclear exercises, and after Trump imposed sanctions. And Putin was finally convinced of the complete failure of his idea. Sends Dmitry Guyrit some absolutely such life-affirming things like the fact that not war is better than war. And how freedom is better than not freedom. What happened? What's the problem? From Putin. I think that the launch of Yarsa is just the answer to the tomahawks. This is just at the moment when Putin already understands that Trump can move to active action. And he is deterring him from at least delivering a tomahawk. Because you remember that with the tomahawk, there was always the idea that it was not that the United States would supply these missiles to Ukraine, but that Russia qualifies the launch of these missiles as missiles that were launched by the American military itself. In other words, it will be a US-Russian conflict, and Russia will perceive these missiles as potential carriers of nuclear weapons. That's what YARS is for. And actually, as you can see, Trump himself joined this version of Putin, claiming that now the Ukrainians themselves cannot launch these missiles. This can only be done by the Americans themselves, and they are not going to do it. So that's where it's clear. But the fact that he sent Dmitriev means that he is trying to understand how much more it is possible to influence the development of the situation with words and promises of an economic nature. Because if Putin is still counting on the fact that he will be able to convince Trump with words and Trump will no longer do anything, then he should send someone to Washington, at least with an intelligence mission. The only thing I think is that it's completely hopeless, I don't believe that Trump will believe Putin's promises unless they are backed up by some concrete actions. Putin has to do something. Well, you see, you understand that. Did Putin really not understand when he called Trump, negotiating with him in Budapest, or what they agreed on there? When he sends part of Dmitry, Trump proposed this to Putin in Budapest. Putin was not against it. But Putin is talking with a signal character. He could have sent some signals to Trump that could have been misinterpreted by the American president. He could lie. But we'll figure it out. How could he have thought that we would now start preparing for the meeting in Budapest? It's going to be a long one. Where 2 weeks, there is a month. Where a month, there and 2. All this time, he will do nothing, will not give them weapons, will not impose new sanctions. And there, if the meeting breaks down, then we will figure it out. He wanted to drag him into such a long-term negotiation process against the backdrop of military operations once again. But this time it didn't work out. Do you know, by the way, why it didn't work out? Because Marco Rubio was at the center of the process, not Steve Witkoff. Trump took that moment into account. And by the way, we heard what he spoke ambiguously about it in his speech in the Knesset. When I said that Witkoff had to go to Moscow for 20 or 30 minutes just to prepare a meeting. And he sat there with him for 5 hours, and I asked him, what are you talking about with him for 5 hours? And he says, it was about what, right? On the one hand, all this is such praise, oh, what kind of Witkoff notices, and how he knows how to talk to everyone. And on the other hand, such almost undisguised mockery that he talks to him for 5 hours, it's no use. He leads such wonderful conversations and achieves nothing as a result. Therefore, while Witkoff went to Moscow, talked there with Kirill Dmitriev, they composed together some utopian plans. Like a tunnel between Alaska and Chukotka through the Bering Strait, then Trump could count on him to achieve some kind of result from Putin. Witkoff could tell him, Donald, you just go to meet them, you will agree on everything with him. Well, as a result, there was a real foreign policy fiasco in Alaska. And now Trump has decided to go the other way, that let Marco Rubio and Sergei Lavrov prepare a meeting, so that there would be some kind of document that they could sign. And I even understand which one. It would have to be a framework document on a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, which Trump would sign with Putin. And he would simultaneously sign it with Zelensky on the model of a grain deal, a one-time deal. Because, understand, Trump probably already realized that he was not able to get Putin's consent to a meeting with Zelensky. That the meeting of the president of Russia and Ukraine will not be, and so you have to go under the scheme Erdogan. I meet them myself, they are in different rooms. Or Zelensky is not in Budapest at all, he is in Kiev, and then we meet with him somewhere there, he arrives in Washington. Or he even comes to Budapest, and we meet separately. And he signs the framework agreement that I signed with Putin. The fire on the Russian-Ukrainian front stops, and they start negotiations. In other words, this is an old plan. But it turned out that Putin did not want to sign it, let alone consider it. First, the root causes of the conflict, that is, first peace talks, then a ceasefire. We returned to the anchorage. Well, Rubio probably explained to Trump that if a meeting takes place in Budapest on such conditions, it will lead to another American shame, and Trump no longer needs shame. And he decided that he would put pressure on Putin until Putin agreed to come to Budapest to sign a ceasefire. That's what his desire and intention is. And Putin, as you say quite correctly, does not know what to do. I mean, he is trying to scare you, but it's not even really pass with Trump in such a situation. Putin had an absolutely wonderful phrase, which can be carved in front of these golden letters, anywhere in Kiev at all. Sovereign powers do not make decisions under pressure. Who would have thought? Yes. Well, we see that now Putin himself is trying one way or another, well, to put pressure on, with the help of Dmitriev. He is probably playing a tricky game now, probably trying to push heads and turns with Rubio, and knock Rubio out, of course. And even Dmitriev in this regard gives an interview on Fox News, where again they embark on lengthy arguments, specifically refusing to give specifics of the Russian position, as if creating the impression among the American audience, apparently. Well, Trump, that in fact there is no Russia, of course, for the world, and this is an interview, and in general. This visit of Dmitriev may lead again to a weakening of Rubio's position, or now Rubio, on the contrary, will strengthen. And Witkoff has no chance to return to his previous position. It's not about Rubio in Russia, it's about Putin. The problem is not that Dmitriev says they are for peace, they say it all the time. The problem is that Putin has to offer and do something concrete. At least something. What he used to offer doesn't work anymore. Let's negotiate, but you don't agree on anything in the negotiations. Let's hold a meeting between Putin and Trump. Wonderful, but you have to agree to a ceasefire at this meeting. There must be a result that will allow Trump to look like a peacemaker. even if it's some kind of intermediate result. Let's first agree on a truce there in the air so that kindergartens and hospitals are not shelled. But since there are no results at all, as you understand, I don't think that Dmitryev's arrival will change anything. You see, Dmitry is already saving himself in this hardware struggle, because he was chosen by Putin to play the role of an air seller. What is the direct investment fund, or is there a special representative of the president? What he exactly? To tell Americans fairy tales. And this position of his to deceive the Americans creates for him a serious hardware weight in the Russian leadership. But there are people who are committed to classical politics. It's not just Lavrov, it's Ruby just in the American establishment, Lavrov in the Russian one. And he just says, why do we need all this? Let them speak clearly. Here are our terms. Don't do it, don't mess with your head. We offered them conditions, they have to agree to them. Actually, what happened between Ruby and Laurel? Lavrov, unlike Dmitriev, did not tell Ruby about any fairy tales. He clearly said, this is our position. Let's coordinate. You have your own position. That's fine. Let the presidents meet and discuss this position. About how to eliminate the root causes of the conflict. This is important and not the ceasefire, you know. Well, Rubio didn't get it. But this is a classic of the genre. To which I think Rubio said, wait, so these are exactly your demands for the surrender of Ukraine, which were at the meeting in Anchorage. And throughout the 3 or 4 years of the war. Well, yes, Lavrov told him, so these are your demands of Trump, who has been offering to cease fire for 9 months. Without eliminating the causes of the conflict, which means that the war will not end. So let's look for a compromise. So to speak. That is. In other words, it seems to me that there was some kind of inevitable schizophrenic conflict inside the Kremlin apparatus itself. That is, when Putin needs a meeting and he blurts Trump. But when it comes to specifics, start working professionals. And professionals naturally can't agree because professionals can't ultimately do what Putin is doing to sell air to Lavrov. No matter what kind of ghoul he is, but he simply has to say what he, by the way, publicly said. He must. He doesn't have a position. Yes. And you see, when Dmitry Vitkov talks among themselves, they talk about nothing. Well, under the most vivid illustration of this story about nothing. This is a wonderful tunnel that is not clear why it is needed at all, when everything can be transported by sea, as they say. And when there are no access roads to Chukotka, and it is necessary to build a railway there, and there are even no railways in Alaska. Do you understand? It is necessary to build railways in permafrost so that this tunnel has some meaning. But Dmitry has already talked about this tunnel, and Trump said a wonderful tunnel, yes. I asked Zelensky if he would like this tunnel. And this is madness, which once again speaks of complete incompetence. This Ostap Benderism is real. You know, we used to read this in satirical books, but now it is said by people who participate in political decision-making. But again, this does not create a platform for agreements, because let's build a tunnel, but first stop the war. Is it possible earlier? First the tunnel, then the war. No one but the chairs then. We see that the European Union conducted synchronous sanctions with the United States. And, by the way, as I understand it, Rosneft and Lukoil are also in this target cage. And it looks like the EU has been conducting secondary sanctions against them as well. In other words, I understand correctly that a real practical rapprochement of the positions of the Trump administration. And the EU has begun, that is, not only at the level of rhetoric, but also at the level of actions. Yes, that's the idea. Joint actions of the anti-energy sector of the Russian Federation and its sponsors in the countries of the Global South. And I believe that we should not underestimate the effect of these sanctions at all. Because, realistically speaking, the result of these sanctions may be India's complete refusal to purchase Russian oil. Those Indian enterprises that continue to cooperate with Rosneft and Lukoil risk falling under US sanctions. With all the consequences, so to speak, and it is not by chance that representatives of the Indian NATO oil refining complex began to say that they would reformat, so to speak, the basket of oil purchases. Most likely they would abandon Russian oil. as it is said to comply with the recommendations of the government of India. Well, this is a really serious story. It is clear that it will not pass with China right away, although it is clear that China will have to think about the situation. Because if its enterprise falls under the sanctions of the European Union and the United States, they are not tariffs there. But just specific enterprises will lose the opportunity to sell their products to the world market. This will also have a negative impact on the Chinese economy. In other words, by and large, the destruction of the Russian energy sector should have been a good result of this war. So that after this war, Russia would not be able to sell its oil and gas, so that wells would be closed, so that deposits would be destroyed, so that the economic crisis would become, I would say, a reality of life in Russia. So that the fullness of the Russian budget, it has become a political fantasy forever, well, at least for the coming decades. And that this would lead to a deafening collapse of the Russian regime and those foundations of imperial statehood that still allow criminal groups to function instead of the Russian state, hiding behind state institutions. In other words, in fact, we are dealing with the beginning of a real replacement of Russian oil with any other oil, because if Russia is losing these markets now, it is already losing. We see that the Indians have started ordering American oil from the Middle East, and the Chinese are already suspending purchases in some places, which means that Russia, just as it lost the gas market in Europe, so it will lose the oil market, but already in the whole world, because these are secondary sanctions. This is the first heavy blow. That's it for this reason. Well, obviously, because it is clear that for China, purchases of Russian oil are largely political. But India bought Russian oil primarily because it was a premium product for it. In other words, it bought cheap Russian oil for rupees, which were then converted into something there in an incomprehensible way. I still don't understand how all these schemes work at all. So then she sold petroleum products made from Russian oil to the Western market, not by hand, as you understand. By the way, this is a well-known Belarusian maneuver for all our viewers. For a decade, Lukashenko bought Russian oil at domestic Russian prices, made oil products from it at Belarusian oil refineries, and sold these oil products at world prices, naturally, without sharing profits with Moscow. It was such a beautiful robbery, the exchange of money for words about friendship and brotherhood, and about the future Union state. Here. But then, when Moscow began to say that this was not very correct at all, there was such a well-known crisis in Russian-Belarusian relations. As it was called there, some kind of tax shift, something like that had already happened there. I don't remember it even before the 2020th year, when Lukashenko was deprived of these super profit. But India is an attack. Russia cannot say that you are selling our daily counterproducts from our oil at a high price. Because Russia simply needs to sell this oil somewhere now. Here. And now, yes, when sanctions are imposed, it is no longer a premium product, because you have to pay dearly for it. And therefore, the most reasonable solution in this situation is to refuse to buy oil of Russian origin. Putin nevertheless says that Russia will somehow survive all this. He says, of course, we will incur some losses, but overall, the Russian energy feels good. And while he spoke with such a face, as if he felt like he was actually not so good, so tell me all the same. The joy on his face was not, and by the way, if you saw the interview Dmitrieva in America, he was there too, to put it mildly. Not very happy expression. Well, because they need a different plan, you know. The plan to breed a sucker has stopped working. We need some other plan. They are not ready for another plan. Well, in other words, they can just hope that Ukraine can somehow capitulate on its own. So they continue to strike at the Ukrainian infrastructure, right? It simply terrorizes Ukraine with ballistic missiles. It is clear that this is also a favorite activity. Here is the last attack on Kiev. When people do not even have the opportunity to hide from this shelling, do you understand? Because 2 minutes pass between the message about the launch of ballistic missiles and the explosions. They perceive this kind of terror as a method of influence, too. In this regard, now everyone is distributing an excerpt from the speech of propagandist Vladimir Solovyev, where he directly says that there will be no life in Kiev, Odessa, Kharkiv, in general, in the major cities of Ukraine. Well, this is their favorite, so to speak, favorite dream, so that there is no life anywhere. That is, the official goal now is like this, that is, just to avoid people. Terror, to make the population revolt. I'm telling you this for sure, I just know it. And their idea is that Ukrainians will rise up and demand from their authorities to capitulate to Russia, so that there is life in Kiev and in Odessa. Does the Trump administration understand that sanctions are not enough and that weapons are needed? If not tomahawks at the moment, then others. After all, there are many other missile weapons, nothing is really clear about them yet, but I think that the Trump administration believes that after the first sanctions, Putin will begin to think about the need for a ceasefire. The escalation will increase. When Putin shows that he does not understand anything and is ready to escalate himself, they will intensify their escalation. We have entered the path of escalation. There will be no turning back if Putin does not take some real steps to cease fire on the Russian-Ukrainian front. That's it. In this regard, the question, Putin, in this his only reaction so far to what is happening, to the sanctions there, to Trump's refusal from Budapest, said one threat. He said that if tomahawks were to fly across Russia, our response would be very serious, if not overwhelming. What do you think he meant by that? I don't know, but he always has the idea that there's a Hazel Yars, whatever. A super weapon that he doesn't say anything about. You notice that both Putin and Trump are always bragging about some kind of weapon that no one knows anything about. I think it's bullying. First of all, the Americans, so that they do not take drastic steps from the point of view of arms supplies to Ukraine. So that Russia keeps some strategic objects there in the confidence that they will not be like that, that's all. Nevertheless, we understand that Ukraine needs urgent weapons. We don't know how much longer Trump will think about the fact that Putin is not going to give up, so to speak. And for this reason, what do you think about the seizure of Russian assets? At least 140 billion euros in Belgian banks is. I don't see it yet. I don't see how they will do it yet. The last meeting at which this was discussed was European. It ended in nothing. And because Belgium cannot in any way get a clear legal basis from the European Union for this kind of confiscation. And this is a great problem, you know. Because the West wants to play by the rules with Russia, and Russia itself violates all the rules. And as long as we live in this situation, you see, it reminds me very much even of what is happening there with freedom of speech. When we always believe that we should tell the truth and expect that there will be competition, so to speak, a fact. And we have a competition of truth with lies, and this is called freedom of speech, and I would say this standard of freedom of speech is brilliantly saddled by Russian propaganda and all sorts of crooks associated with Moscow. They lie. And we are forced to oppose lies all the time. It's not just that there are some facts to discuss that can be perceived differently from different sides, but simply to oppose lies. And it is obvious to say there, when we lived in Soviet times, the Bolsheviks substituted facts, lies. And we are only now learning about a lot of things that in fact we lived there in a reality that never existed. A lot of historical factors and political facts have simply never existed in history, but we argued with this there. Is it so or not so? Is it good or bad? And this event could not be found. That is now, when it seems to be the time of social networks and television and videos on the internet. But nevertheless the lies continue, and we are dealing with a huge number of people who are more comfortable believing lies than perceiving the truth. The same thing happens with international law. Russia violates it every day. When Putin says that a sovereign power should not respond to pressure, you can always ask him, but what about the Russian-Ukrainian war? Isn't this Putin's pressure on a sovereign power? But, nevertheless, we are dealing with this idiotic situation, when we have to be completely, so to speak. God forbid the court will make some decision not in our favor. And in Russia, the courts make all decisions in their favor, you know. And everything is fine. Therefore, it is impossible to exist at the same time. By the way, this is the catastrophe that occurred after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that Russian money can be in Western banks, while the West must behave legally, and Russia can violate all laws, you know. And of course, do not touch any Russian money, because this is a violation of the law. Yes, I do not know how to get out of this situation. These are rights and a trap, you know. Yes, indeed, Russia is years, decades abused international law, when it received from international law, all. And giving nothing that is nothing. But the lack of responsibility and responsibilities. Yes, this is what I'm saying, this is the result of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because the Soviet Union was an isolated system. Yes, they were violating any rights, they violate international law, they violated human rights. But in its, so to speak, part of the world, they could not sue you in court on the West, right? They could not demand from Interpol that you be detained, because everyone understood that this is not a legal regime, where there is no justice, no truth, nothing. And here Russia seems to be a participant in some international conventions, organizations, but in fact, it is the same Soviet Union, just taking advantage of opportunities to influence the West. And, strikingly, the West still has not recognized Russia, relatively speaking, with North Korea. Because no one would think to ask the North Koreans why you fled from there and demand to renew your passport at the embassy and so on. There are no embassies with North Korea. And as a Russian diplomat, only now, in the 4th year of the war, the European Union is beginning to limit the possibility of movement a little bit, although every diplomat is, relatively speaking, a Grushnik. Well, of course, yes. And why do we need Russian embassies in the world at all? In order to collect intelligence information. It was the same in Soviet times. Of course, there were some career diplomats there, but in general, they were always just a screen for the work of the KGB. Nevertheless, Vitaly, well, Putin lost this round. Why do you think he lost? They didn't see the next move there. Or they just acted like that, so we'll look at the fact. There will be some kind of problem, we will solve it. Do I understand correctly? Putin is a very bad strategist, but he is a brilliant tactician, that's a fact. But he is a very bad strategist, and he never thinks about what is from a long-term perspective. Well, this, by the way, was the result of what happened with Ukraine. There was a tactical task, a blitzkrieg change of power. To answer the question, what will we do if the blitzkrieg fails? In general, no one even tried. We'll figure it out. And yes, then they began to sort out and translate the war into a multi-year war of attrition. But you understand that if they had thought from the very beginning that they would enter a war of attrition, they would have prepared for it differently, and maybe they would not have started it. And the war of attrition is precisely the result of the fact that Russia is led by a person with a lack of strategic thinking. Yes, he may have some dreams there, he is somewhere out there hovering in his dreams, but as a politician, he is not a strategist. Therefore, he had a tactical idea to keep Trump from any drastic steps, from any new sanctions, any actions to help Ukraine. Now, when, by and large, this story ends, I think he doesn't know what to do, that's why he's freaking out. He may come up with something for a short-term perspective, but so far he has not come up with anything, except to send Dmitry. To say there, let's process the old and let's go ahead. That is, it's like this. Literally, well, how to say, an impulsive decision is a reaction, yes, a momentary one. You see, when we talk about strategy, it already assumes that a person is a politician. But when a mafia man is a strategist, what do you think? Well, he's acting like a mobster. Yes, so he acts like a mafioso. It's absolutely true that mafia leaders always have very good tactical steps. But they don't think strategically, because the main thing for them is to hold out. Yes, to send a member of his gang to negotiate, means with a representative, as he believes, of another gang of the same kind. He's like that. Another of the gang, yeah, see what happens. Maybe it will be possible to deceive them again, and it will not be possible, but we will think about what to do next. Maybe we'll scare them further, maybe they'll get scared. We won't be able to frighten, but we will send someone to negotiate again. We're going to work somehow at all, work with this, work with this material. Meeting in London of the Coalition of Willing. What do you think about this? This is serious progress forward, because quite serious decisions are being made there. Here I am counting. Serious progress forward, right? And Swedish planes and discussion of the topic of sanctions. There are a lot of important decisions there, if you will, which are not so much demagoguery as it always was before. I wouldn't say with a set of good wishes, right? But now these are concrete proposals to abandon Russian oil and gas, which we discussed with you in our conversation. To continue the discussion about unblocking Russian assets, unblocking for Ukraine, and I mean strengthening military support for Ukraine. And again it says about the need to transfer long-range missiles to Ukraine. These may not necessarily be American missiles. It is simply important that Ukraine has the potential to destroy the Russian military-industrial energy complex. Well, this is the main point. And by the way, there are talks about new arms supplies from France, Great Britain. And the fact that the discussion about multinational forces continues. Because maybe at some point this discussion will go from quantity, as they say, to quality. In other words, I mean that it will still be decided that these multinational forces can appear on the territory of Ukraine without Moscow's consent. It would actually be a breakthrough. There, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said that Putin is running out of people, money and ideas. Would you agree with this statement? Or it's more of a wish for the future and a kind of, propaganda too. The fact that Putin is running out of ideas in the sense of fooling Trump is a fact. The fact that Putin is running out of money, there are not so many of them for the war, and I hope that the pressure on the Russian energy complex will lead to an even greater end of money for the war, because, in principle, the ideal option would be a complete collapse of the Russian economy. Because it would have ensured both Ukraine and Europe if Russia had finally focused on its survival, on the survival of its population. Then at least we would have had 10 or 20 quiet years there, maybe when we could adequately prepare for it to overcome its difficulties, for its new aggressive plans. So I think as far as people are concerned, they may not end, but you can see that there are fewer and fewer people who want to fight for money. People are huge victims, it's not so easy to compensate. I'm not saying that it's easy for Ukraine. As you know, it's not very easy with people, with mobilization, either. We don't have our own money, as they say here. But Putin is always in front of what he absolutely does not want to resort to the transition from the mercenary army to army recruits. And this is a completely different story. My last question, please tell me how would you assess the role of the Ukrainian administration in this big diplomatic race? You would say that this is also a kind of victory for Kiev, of course. Yes, I think that in any case, this is our achievement in the sense that we make it clear that we are not going to leave the territories controlled by the legitimate Ukrainian government. I do not think at all that the topic of the fact that the Ukrainian army should leave its own territories from somewhere, because I remind you that in general, this is a war on Ukrainian soil, that Russia occupied part of Ukrainian territory, that all these referendums in the Crimea, in the Donbas and so on are fake letters, that Russia occupied the territory and forces the population of this territory to vote for joining Russia or fakes these results. The vast majority of people in the occupied territories would not want the end of the Russian occupation and the worthy punishment of the collaborator. I assure you that if Russia had left about this, and, of course, a huge number of collaborators would have left with it, most of the people who live in the occupied territories would be only too happy to part with this bandit terrorist regime and its accomplices, because there is a mafia regime everywhere, and there is even, by the way, a difference, I think, even from the mainland of Crimea from the mainland. Because if in Crimea they still left the power of the former Crimean the elite, because it was originally a bandit, then in the Donbass and other occupied territories they simply brought a bandit to power. It is clear that I would like people to get rid of these mafiosi, so that they were adequately punished too. But in any case, to leave to this mafia, to this gang, also those territories that are held by the Ukrainian army. It would be very strange at all. I think this position was also brought to the attention of the President of the United States, because he clearly then began to talk about a ceasefire along the demarcation line. Yes, well, he did change his attitude towards Zelensky, yes, and vice versa. As if he worsened his attitude towards Putin in the beginning, he called Zelensky the best seller of air. Now he respects Zelensky and Ukrainian. At least he speaks of Zelensky with respect, let's say. Yes. So it seems to me that this is both the work of Zelensky and the work of the Ukrainian leadership, and the work of Europeans who spent a lot of time with the green Ukrainian officials. We explain how to build communication with the new administration. Thank you for your assessment, Vitaly. See you soon.